So I think we're finally ready to get started. So hello, everyone. I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 Facebook group. And I'm here tonight with Nancy Griesemer, who is an independent college counselor and runs a company called College Explorations. And Nancy, you've been in the business for a while, which is great because you've got a lot of history, a lot of knowledge. Do you want to give a little bit of a background of how long you've been doing this and the types of families you work with?
Well, I've been doing this 20 years, and I pretty much restrict myself to families in Northern Virginia, although I work a lot with other college consultants across the country. I used to write a column regularly. I don't do that as much anymore, but I am working on a revision of a book. I'm also a member of the Character Collaborative, and I'm on the Princeton Review board of college counselors. And I have probably a little bit too much of a historic perspective, and I can tell war stories that may or may not interest you.
No, I think it's good to know the war stories. Okay, so I see we've got a lot of people here across the country, from California, Colorado, New York, Texas. Great. So as I'm sure we're all comfortable being in Zooms these days, so you can put your questions in the chat. I'm going to run some slides, so I will try and check over to the questions as things are going. But tonight we just wanted to give people a kind of just insights into some of the numbers that that are happening, and the numbers that. And actually, let me share my screen so we'll get started. Okay, can just give me a thumbs up. Can you, Nancy? Can you see? Okay, great. I'll actually go to the agenda. And tonight, this is recorded, and we always send a link to the recording tomorrow if you have to pop off. Sorry, just getting the chat back on. So we're going to share information, which actually is put together by the Common App itself. And so it gives people, it gives other colleges, it gives college counselors, it gives high school counselors, and it gives families, if you're interested to go look for it, an idea of what's happening, and the information is based on as of applications that came in that ended November 1st, so with the big early admissions push. So again, so keep that in mind, that most of the information we're talking about is only applying to the early admission cycle that just ended. So that's some of the information we're going to talk about. And then we have a little bit of information, again, from the Common App that summarizes, highlights from last year, kind of like a big summary of where things ended, and again in terms of applications and applicants and where people were applying from. That gives you again a little bit of an insight into maybe what particularly families with juniors might want to do next year. Then we do have some, because Nancy and I were talking about that earlier, and we'll tell you our reasons, our ideas why. We only have a sprinkling of actual results from colleges that are sharing those numbers this year. And then we'll try and summarize this, for what you guys should do with all this information. But let me just start off by saying, and again, Nancy and I were talking about this earlier, nobody has perfect information, so we are doing our best with what we're seeing. And as Nancy mentioned earlier, we're steeped in this information. We like to look at it all the time. We've been looking at it for years, and we still don't exactly know what's going on. And so honestly, if anybody tells you that they know what's going on, I can't believe them, because and Nancy will tell you again, she was listening to the dean of admissions at Duke, and he might know what's going on at Duke, but he doesn't know what's going on with all the other schools. So I don't know if that gives you comfort. There is no comfort. It's not, the only comfort is knowing that we're all kind of in the same boat. But we're going to do our best, and please feel free to ask questions. Okay, so I do want to clarify, somebody was asking, what we're going to talk about does cover early decision and early action. So it's really anything that happened, again, up to that November 1st deadline. Okay.
Right. I think sometimes it's worth just mentioning that early admissions does cover early action and early decision. And the difference between the two, early decision is binding. It's when a family signs an agreement that if the student is admitted, they will definitely attend the college. And early action is non-binding. And the student has until May 1st to decide whether or not they want to attend the school. I think for lots of times it's very easy to get them kind of backwards and confused. But early admission is the umbrella. Early action is non-binding. Early decision is binding. We talked about the you know, how binding it was in our last session. But if you just sort of understand that the agreement is that you will attend if accepted.
Great. Yes. Thanks, Nancy, for clarifying. Okay. So on the biggest level, you know, the Common App has been seeing an increase in the number of applicants, and kind of, I'll try and be distinct to say there's different. Obviously, we're going to talk about applicants and applications. So the number of applicants who have been applying early has been continuing to increase. And the comparisons that we're making are comparisons back to from this year, comparing it back to 2019, 2020, which was right before the pandemic hit. Because that's, you know, if it's any sort of normalcy, that was when things were more normal, you know, before everything hit with the pandemic, and where majority of colleges went test optional. But comparing this year's volume, which is 118,000 applicants, that's a 26% increase compared to, again, the pre-pandemic years. And it's still an increase from last year. It's an 11% increase from what the numbers of applicants that sent in applications this year compared to last year. And then we're going to kind of unpack a little bit about where those applicants are coming from, you know, and Nancy will talk also a little bit about just the increase or the lack of increase coming of the number of high school students, and why colleges and why there are different subgroups of students that are kind of increasing in the terms of the number of the applicants who are sending in applications.
It's maybe worth pointing out that the 841, again, as Debbie said, was the number when we were coming into the pandemic and test optional came into play. The Common App now has well over 1,000 member colleges. So there's been also a significant growth in the size of the Common App. But for comparisons purposes, so apples to apples, we're looking at the core 841 colleges that were there when the world turned upside down on us.
Actually, so that's a really good point. The Common App hasn't actually released, or not that I've seen those numbers. They probably had more than 748,000 applicants, but for comparison purposes, we're just looking at the colleges that were a part of the Common App in 2019 versus the those that are still in there today, so we can make this apples to apples comparison. Okay, so then in terms of applications, right, we're still continuing to see this type of increase. So as of November 1st, there were 2,583,554 applications that were submitted. Again, that's a 41% increase this year compared to before the pandemic, and a 10% increase from last year to this year. And we'll continue to see in the numbers, as you can already guess by looking at these two numbers between applicants and applications, is that the number of applications that students are submitting per student is increasing. And, you know, we can talk about why, but you can start to see the story being built. And then another interesting, you know, fact that, you know, hasn't really changed that much over the years, but it's just something for people to know, again, as it relates to early admissions, is that a bulk of applicants, in this case, about 61%, tend to come from the highest income zip codes. I mean, probably most of the people who are on the call tonight, we're probably in those types of zip codes. We're just more informed about the process. We understand, the potential, in some cases, advantages to apply early, whether it's early decision or early action. So it's not uncommon to see this type of distribution. But what we have seen is that since before the pandemic, there has been a continued increase. It's not huge, but if you look at the lower two quintiles, the income quintiles, that there's been an increase in those two groupings as well. So the highest quintile of incomes increased by 22%, and the lowest two increased by 27%. So they're both increasing, but the bottom is starting to increase a little bit more. And then we are seeing a pretty large increase in the number of applications that students are sending to public schools versus private schools. So again, if you compare the two, public versus private, and comparing them versus pre-pandemic, public school has seen an increase of 44% versus private schools of an increase of 28%. And I mean, I have some theories. I mean, honestly, one is just pure cost, that public schools, particularly if they're your in-state schools, are going to tend to be some of your better schools from a cost perspective. And so, as the private schools costs are increasing, even though a lot of them are giving merit scholarships, your quote best financial deal is sometimes still your in-state public school. So it's not surprising from a financial standpoint that that's become more popular. I don't know, Nancy, if you have any thoughts. You were kind of mentioning before a little bit about maybe burnout, or
Well, I think, as the total number of applications are continuing to increase per student, it's only natural to begin to include more and more of the colleges that you feel safe. You need to balance. We keep talking about having a balanced list of colleges, and as you add on the more selective schools, the ones that you're sort of taking a chance on, you want some more security by balancing your list with the locals. Now, historically, people haven't traveled that far from home to go to college. That usually we stay pretty close to home, and I think that the pandemic has also affected the desirability of staying close to home. And with the sudden closures of colleges, or the things that have happened, kids are feeling a little bit, and families are feeling a little bit more comfortable about having their students closer to home. Of course, there's always the one who's going to fly across the country, and I have one of each. And but nevertheless, you have we're pushing very loudly the financial safety, the financial safe school. And we want you to be looking at those kinds of considerations, but also there is an uneasiness about going a little bit further from home, and adding to that with this not even super selective anymore, they're hyper selective groups of colleges. There is a certain burnout. I'm getting tired of beating my head against the wall and not getting in. And maybe, I know that my local public institution will provide my child with a wonderful education, and I need to look closer and consider it. And I think that's a little bit of what's going on.
Yeah, no, I agree. Okay, and then, oops. Not going. The next piece of information is really just looking at schools where by selectivity in terms of who's seeing the largest change in apps. And I think this is directly impacted by test optional. So, the schools that have admit rates of less than 25% saw the biggest gain, from pre-pandemic to today, with a 45% increase in applications. And again, we know that the floodgates kind of opened when more and more colleges went test optional. And particularly, last year was a big jump, and we saw a little bit of a jump this year, but more students are kind of willing to take the chance and say, okay, like maybe, if I had to send in my test scores, I might not apply to X, Y, and Z school, but now that I don't, I'll give it a shot. And so that's kind of driving some of these applications at the really selective level.
Well, I think there is a lot feeding this, and certainly test optional is the central driver. That when it became possible to envision yourself at a particular institution, putting aside the scores that I've, test anxiety, or I'm, just not a good test taker, but I know that I am a great student and that I would do well at any of these schools. Certainly that has driven, kind of a lottery mentality about, well, I'm just going to throw my hat in the ring and try. And that has increased applications significantly to the most selective schools. But you also have to remember that the most selective schools prior to the pandemic had begun a pattern of recruitment. And I don't know whether you want to talk about that now or not, but certainly we've known for a long time what the size of the demographics of the numbers of high school students that are out there and will likely to apply to colleges during particular time periods. And although it fluctuates a little bit here and there, we could see long in the distance that eventually there was going to be a kind of a fall off of college applications or college applicants from college going families in particular. And starting a number of years ago, prior to the pandemic, colleges began to do some serious recruitment of various groups. And we can talk about that further later on. But in any event, increased recruitment among certain sectors, the availability of virtual contact with colleges make colleges more familiar. Colleges have put $1 zillion into virtual tours and college fairs and this and that. Students are now being able to see and put themselves into schools that they never thought they could, that they had no familiarity with. So there are a lot of factors in this. Again, central to it, test optional,
right.
Pivot to test optional.
Nancy, somebody wrote, and I'm not sure this particular comment is a driver, but she said, did the SUNY free week have an impact on the charts? I'm not sure about the SUNY free week alone, but I think the concept of colleges offering, waiving their application fees and kind of, doing more marketing just to get students to send in their applications absolutely impacted this chart.
Sure. And a number of private public institutions not only held their tuition rates even, but in fact, some of them have begun to drop tuition rates. The public institutions are seeing an opening and are trying to, possibly recruit students financially, as well as being able to sell that their academics are first rate as well. Certainly that free week, I know it made applications there very desirable.
Yeah. I mean, the SUNY, there were a lot of other states that kind of did like the free week, and I don't have those particular numbers. I'd love to see them, but I am sure it created spikes. Okay. So if we turn a little bit to international, again, I mean, my chart actually maybe doesn't do this justice because it looks like it went down. And so, and if we compare from last year to this year, the percent of international might have gone down. But if you compare it overall to, again, the pre-pandemic, it's been a 63% increase from 2019 to this year. So that's big. At the same time, domestic applicants increased 20%, but It's, and the pool of international students is still obviously significantly smaller, but that 63% increase is something to watch for. And I don't know, Nancy, if you want to give the comment that you said to me before about all the states that Duke was recruiting from, and then where international fell.
Well, in this presentation, and it's a YouTube presentation for those of you who are interested.
I have no idea what you're saying. What?
Did you see the speaker down
Oops,
there?
go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry,
I didn't
Nancy.
look, honey.
That's okay.
I'm sorry.
Oops.
I thought I last saw it on the kitchen counter by like,
Oops, sorry.
Under
We're
the
trying. Okay, go ahead. Sorry, got it.
It's a YouTube presentation that Dean Gutentag did late last week, just before the Duke admissions early decision results came out, and he was very, very transparent and pretty much talked about different kinds of decision making that they went through in admitting the early decision class, and you might be interested in it. But in any event, the top 5 states in their early decision pool, just to tell you, number 1 was North Carolina, no surprise there. Number 2, New York, California, Texas, Florida. But number 6, international students. And I think if you're paying attention to a lot of the press releases that are going out, and Debbie and I have been talking about sort of the deficit of information this year, but for those schools that are releasing information around their admissions, look at the percentage. They're being pretty open about the percentage of the admitted pool that is from the international group coming in, and with, again, the largest is from China, although that is kind of going down a little bit, and India is going up. In any event, the numbers of international applicants and the international admissions is really one of the big factors of the selectivity that you're seeing going out there. And as I started to say before, we've known for a long time that, that the numbers are going of high school graduates are going to decrease. And most importantly, they're going to decrease in college going history and perspective, background, families that have history of college going history. And so years ago, long before the pandemic, colleges began to recruit in other countries, and they sent big groups over abroad to recruit, and knowing that they wanted to fill in some of the blanks because they were looking at a cliff of applicants. Now, this changed a little bit during the Trump years when things became very difficult in terms of getting visas and getting squared away about coming to school. And so the numbers began to drop off during those 4 years. But almost within, I'd say, interestingly, this report that we're using from the Common App, the one that came out at exactly the same time in 2020, was all doom and gloom. Numbers are going down. The colleges are going, it's all going crazy. There aren't enough applicants, blah, 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 blah. Almost within a week or two after the election of 2020, and it was clear that the Trump administration was not going to be continuing, it was like a faucet turned on. Suddenly, the international applicants began to return. And they began to return even in greater numbers when we got COVID under control, when the families felt more comfortable about their children coming here, and they could get their paperwork straightened out. And since then, the numbers have just skyrocketed. And if you trace the numbers of admits, among especially the most selective schools, you'll see that their percentage of the classes have been increasing substantially.
And Nancy, do you want to maybe give some explanation? Why is it attractive to the colleges to?
Well, for the most part, I think it's no secret that the international students are full pay.
Right.
And there's that's not universally the case. And of course, there are certainly colleges that do offer scholarships to international students and financial support for international students. But the initial attraction has historically been that the students are fully supported. that they pay, and so we don't have to go through trying to figure out. And it's no secret that money is in short supply, and the colleges are feeling the crunch just like families are feeling the crunch. Even I'm incredibly feeling the crunch. The cost of just, putting the dining hall together and feeding students and housing them and so forth, and the rest of everything that sort of came out of the COVID experience. Colleges are reeling, and they can't recoup it, and they can't charge what they need to charge to recoup it. And so they're looking for, again, some possible sources of financial support. Now, I can't say that universally across the board. And some colleges have been very generous with international students, but they are historically a source of good income.
So would you think for junior families, should they pay more attention to, the schools that they might be researching for their, with their students, if they can, to dig into kind of what the pattern or the history has been with that particular school in terms of, the acceptance of international applicants, and if they're seeing a trend that's increasing?
Well, I don't know that I would, that's something to look for. I think what I would be more curious about, and is the information isn't always out there, is that once you see the selectivity, and if a selectivity is going down below 15 or even 25% the level, you're getting into a crapshoot. I'm sorry, it is. And when you get into a situation where Harvard, for example, is telling you, like last year, they admitted like 3.8% of their class, and then when you drill into the admissions and you see what percent were legacies and what percent were first generation, you see maybe 10% legacies, 10, 11, 12% legacies. And then you see the first generation is going up to as high as 19, 20, 21%. They are mutually exclusive. So then you add them together, and there goes a third of that 3.8% right there. In other words, what Debbie's suggesting is drilling into looking at not just the selectivity,
Right.
but looking at who's being admitted and what the trend is at the college as well.
And then you can start to see kind of where your slice or where your student slice sits, these numbers are made up of lots of subgroups. And so when you start to peel the onion away, unfortunately, it gets even smaller about what might be left for, your student who might come from a public school or a private school and, is necessarily international and isn't a minority, and so then you start to understand what their chances may or may not be. Right.
And with the selectivity, we focus on a set of colleges, and back to the public versus private question again, it's the majority of those very selective schools happen to be private. We have the public Ivy group, Virginia, Michigan, North Carolina, some of the UCs. But the vast majority of colleges in the country really welcome your application, really need your application. And I think that I'm sensing with my group of students, my families, more of a willingness to not, of course, they want to play the game and try and win the lottery, but at the same time, the reality of finding good fit colleges that aren't quite those big names is becoming, parents, again, that's sort of that burnout factor, that they really want to get through the process without the hysteria of this past week, which was at a lot of high schools, a difficult week. As a lot of kids were very disappointed in their early decision results.
So Nancy, there's a good question here. I'll read it and summarize it. Heather's asking, I'm interested in the professional perspective of the admission rate stats with state schools. What is the perspective about out-of-state, and more particular, the international students recruited at state schools? They live in California. My student will likely not get into most of the UCs, and even some of the selected CSU schools here, even with a 3.9 unweighted GPA, but will most likely get into more of the selective out-of-state schools. So,
Well, I mean, your in-state students will always have the advantage for the state school. I mean, if you look at the percent admitted that are in-state students versus the percent of out-of-state or international, the in-state student has the advantage. And whether I work with UVA, UVA numbers all the time, and it's definitely much harder to get into UVA from out of state. And I think also probably much harder to get in as an international student, definitely. So at the base, an in-state student always has the advantage. Now it may not work out, it might not be as big an advantage as you would want. But a college will say, we can't just have students from our state. We need to have different perspectives on campus. We need to have different populations to enrich our program. And so, of course, we want to have some out-of-state students. Now, in Virginia, we have a gentleman's agreement that it's not legislated, unlike North Carolina, which actually has legislation. In Virginia, it's a gentleman's agreement that the public schools will not accept any more than 30% of the undergraduates out of state. And they pretty much toe that line, or they run into some problems. In North Carolina, you have a legislated cap, which is 18% out of state. So that's kind of your advantage. Although many more students apply from in-state, they still have a greater advantage in being admitted.
and do you have any opinions about students going to, I guess the flagship out-of-state schools, being an out-of-state student and paying the out-of-state tuition, and comparing that maybe to, other places that they could or should be looking at?
Well, I mean, again, we're looking for good fit schools. And for example, quite frequently, a business student in Virginia might be, of course, we have a wonderful McIntyre is an amazing business program, but you apply sophomore year. There's no guaranteed admission. Compare that with an equally as fine business program at the University of Michigan, Ross School of Business, where it is direct admit business. So you go right into the business program from day one. You start your day. You don't have to you're not taking a chance. Whereas McIntyre only accepts about 65% of its applicants, leaving a lot of kids who apply to Virginia and expect to have a business degree out in the cold. So there are reasons why an in-state student would want to be looking at an out-of-state school. And largely it goes to what kinds of programs and opportunities and how those programs and opportunities fit the individual student.
Okay, I'm going to jump to just to, we've been talking about this a little bit, look at the actual numbers of some subgroups of students, and particularly URM stands for underrepresented minorities, and first gen are students whose parents did not attend college. And these groups are probably the groups that benefited a lot from the test optional opportunities, because a lot of people felt that the students here in the era where everybody took tests, they might not have felt that they could use their test scores and apply to certain schools. Now with test optional, they don't have to worry about, what their test score is, and they might still be a strong student, but not have that strong test score. And so there has been an increase. And also part of it is also what Nancy talked about, the schools purposely recruiting to try and get students in these subgroups to apply. There's, since 2019 to compare to today, there's an increase of 32% of underrepresented minority students who have applied to college, and then an increase of 43% in the first gen students. So I think that diversity that the colleges are working towards is working. But again, if your student doesn't fall into one of these subgroups, then the number of students, the more traditional students, the numbers are being taken away from that group.
There's a good question that's in the box, just flashed up on my screen. Yes, it means that neither parent has attended university here or abroad. There's one college exception to that, and I believe it's Brown University has a more a broader definition of first generation. But the federal definition and the definition that most colleges use is that neither parent has any college has graduated from a four-year institution, has college going, background. So I get that question quite frequently because I work with a lot of South Asian families, and that, they'll say, well, I got my undergraduate degree in wherever. And does that count? Yes, it counts, because you have a college going history, track record in your family. And that advantages your children. And this is what we're, trying to broaden our pool to bring in underrepresented, and that can also be rural students. There are a number of colleges that are putting on a huge press to, reach high schools, and virtual tours and virtual programming and so forth makes this possible where it hadn't been possible before. But we didn't ordinarily visit these colleges or have them on the radar screen. So underrepresented can be different states. It can be rural population. It can be inner city kids who are coming from high schools that don't ordinarily send students to colleges. Again, looking at the demographics, we need to begin to bring these students who haven't been whose families have no college going history into the pool. And we also need to get some sort of alpha students where you get a student on campus from an underrepresented group that has a wonderful experience and brings along the community and has them become interested in going to college as well. So there are lots of reasons that we are looking for these populations to fill in where the demographics are dropping off, and of course to improve opportunity among these groups as well.
So maybe Nancy, you can explain, but a little bit of what's difficult for colleges as these groups of students apply more. It's hard for colleges to necessarily manage their yield as well.
Right. Well, it's a very interesting phenomenon so far. The colleges are recruiting heavily, and the coalition application and the common application both have worked very hard to go to high schools and so forth and help students fill out applications. And they're doing all kinds of things to recruit the students, and the applications are going up. And the admissions for these groups are going up. But interestingly, they are not yielding. And yield is the percent of students that accept an offer of admission. And they are not yielding quite as well as the colleges had hoped. There are certain things that you can't predict. Again, there are certain populations where it's very clear that the families do not want their students to go far from home. And there are lots of reasons for this. So far, it's been kind of one of the unpredictable parts of this, that yes, we've successfully recruiting more applications. We are admitting more students, but they're not necessarily coming. One of the things, and Debbie and I were talking about this beforehand, a lot of what goes on in terms of behind the curtains in the admissions offices has to do with enrollment management. And these are basically programs that have been put in place, and the most popular in the country is Slate, which is run by Technolutions. And they are computer support for decision making in the admissions process. And these last 3 years have been very difficult. If any of you are involved with customer relations management, CRM programs and so forth, you know that they're dependent on data in. And the last 3 years have been an anomaly since the test optional policies have been put into place. The data is not good. So it's been very, very hard. The first year of the pandemic, if you look back at Debbie's charts, you see how the admissions, the data all went down.
Yeah.
It went down. And we fed that into our computers. And so the next year, the decisions in terms of the numbers that we were going to accept and what groups we're going to accept them in weren't real good. And so we over-enrolled, and virtually every public institution I know of in Virginia, with one exception, over-enrolled. Now, they didn't necessarily publicize that, but then the next year they had to compensate. So you have 2 years that are kind of screwy, and then the third year we're still trying to get these programs to reach a leveling point.
And this is the third year. It's only the third year in with you know, kind of a seesaw of data.
Right. I think there's evidence that there's leveling off, that we're getting better in the test optional world. We're getting better at predicting things, but still there are these pockets of underrepresented groups that we can't exactly predict what they're going to do, and the numbers are kind of crazy and all over the place. And so you've had a couple of years of over enrollment, which it's not good news. I mean, sometimes you'll say, well, gee, if they yielded above what was expected, that they must be happy. They're getting all that tuition money. Well, no, they got to have beds for these
Housing, yeah.
Housing, food. They have to have professors in place, and all this costs money. And if it's an unexpected, situation I had kids. Virginia Tech is a good example of sort of the seesawing in the numbers, and they had over enroll one year, and then they draw from their wait list the next year, and it's back and forth and up and down. And, I had kids who were sleeping in, rooms that were created for 2 students that were bunked up to 4, and some practically, and in the meantime, they had to go out there and build dormitories or residence halls. We don't call them the residence halls very rapidly, which they did. I mean, Virginia Tech's been great. They've been putting up, a wonderful community of housing, but still it's had an impact on the predictability. And from your perspective as a parent, there's nothing more frustrating than to be in a situation where you can't at least give a reasonable projection of what your child's odds are of getting admitted. I get these questions continuously from families. Well, tell me what do you think they're going to get in?
So hard
They're
to know.
great students. Yeah. They're fantastic. They should get in. They would succeed if they got in. But I'm not that computer deciding how many and where and what state and what gender and so forth is going to be getting in. So anyway, the point is that the predictability, the enrollment management programs have been kind of stymied by the data they've been getting, and have had a hard time figuring this all out, and which results in over enrollment.
So there's a question, and that's actually my next slide, about are colleges tracking how students who are accepted test optional versus, actually I read this wrong, but here's the, somebody's asking, are colleges tracking how students who are accepted test optional versus non-test optional do as students? Are any patterns emerging? Yes, they are absolutely tracking.
Absolutely. And again, you're seeing a pattern where the colleges are slowly saying, okay, well, we're going to extend test optional another year. We're going to extend it another year. And in this, once we have 4 years, what we want to do is we want to look at academic performance of test optional versus, the submitters and non-submitters. We also want to look at their persistence, and persistence is defined as, basically, do they stick with the program? Do they come back after freshman year? And then lastly, we want to look at their graduation rates, and that's going to take 4 years. Now, to date, the data has been very encouraging that little differences have appeared, but nothing that would change anybody's mind about the value, the plus parts of test optional. And from a college's perspective, the plus parts are, involves the ability to consider students who ordinarily would not have thought about applying.
So here are the numbers about the students who again, this is early, the students who applied without test scores. So as we know, before the pandemic, only 45% of schools were even test optional, and majority of students obviously were sending in applications with scores. Last year, 90% of the schools were test optional, and 51% of the students were still sending in their scores. We saw a little bit of a drop this year, an increase in the number of schools that are test optional went up to 96%, and 48% of students are sending in their scores. But let me actually jump to the next slide, because even though that 48%, again, there's pockets where it differs. So if you actually look at, again, the subgroups of underrepresented minorities, 39% of those students do not send in a test score versus everybody else, 49% that do. So the URM are not sending in their scores at the same rate as other students. First gens are not sending in their test scores at the same rate, and obviously students that get also fee waivers are not sending in their scores at the same rate. So if you actually understand the numbers, that means that some other group is they have more students sending in test scores, and those tend to be students that come from more affluent zip codes. So Go ahead, Nancy.
Well, I was going to say the other pocket, and the Common App report kind of references this, is the number of students who pick and choose which colleges that they're going to submit scores from. It's not, don't think for a moment that somebody who's decided they're not going to submit scores do it for all their colleges, or that they're going to submit to all their colleges. What we're seeing is increasing pattern of picking and choosing. I will send my scores to this college, I won't send my scores to that college. And that is also related to advising, income, all these other things that students who know more and understand the policies more, or the procedures more, will pick and choose. They'll send scores to some schools and not to others. And that's just a sort of a sub number that the Common App is also watching.
But this is also what's kind of just in the past, 2-3 years has caused this whole process to become a little bit more chaotic or, unstable, because, first of all, should your student even be, taking a test? And then if they take the test, where should they be submitting their scores? These are all decisions that didn't have to be made before. And now we're making them, school by school. So it just becomes
horribly complex.
Yes.
And frustrating and upsetting. And one of the side effects of test optional, which it doesn't take a degree in mathematics to know, that if only your highest scoring students are submitting scores, the mid ranges are going up. And so when we say, well, the general advice to students is, if your scores fall in the mid-range, the published mid-range, by the way, which sometimes lags a year, then you can feel more comfortable, and especially if it's on the upper end or above the mid-range, in sending the scores in. However, these mid-ranges, I track them in Virginia for every public institution in Virginia. The mid-ranges are hopping up rapidly. And so what would have been an okay score to submit last year wouldn't be enough okay scores to submit this year. And the complication, so there are a number of people who are saying test optional isn't doing the job we thought it was going to do. And in terms of reducing anxiety around test taking and test submission, it's doing just the opposite. It's making it much worse. And so a number of people are also suggesting you either say clearly you want scores like MIT and Georgetown and Purdue now, or you go test free, meaning that you don't submit scores at all. And that truly takes the anxiety away.
It takes the anxiety away from the family, but it doesn't, take it takes the advantage away from the colleges of what they're enjoying.
Right. Now, just back to the Duke presentation, I wanted to say that for the early decision pool, 60% of their applicants, 60% submitted scores, a little bit over 50%. However, in their admitted group, 70% submitted scores. And of course, he's like, well, that's just sort of a minor difference. And so, but these are the kinds of things that we're looking at in terms of judging, does a college really want the scores or not? Sometimes the request for scores is hidden in language on the website, where they say, well, we highly encourage scores. And sometimes it's hidden in the requirements for going test optional. But looking at numbers also kind of makes you begin to see that some schools, when they're admitting more students with scores than without, they will explain it that, of course, the wonderful students that we ordinarily admit score well, and of course they're submitting scores, and so that makes perfect sense that we would be admitting more of them because it goes together. This is all a big package. But on the other hand, you look at some of them and you say, it's so out of balance that really, if you don't submit the scores, that you really are putting yourself
well, and
as a
maybe
handicap.
Nancy, you're kind of answering it, but maybe you can be more direct as a woman, is asking what would be the reason for submitting or not submitting a score?
Well, I mean, usually the advice is if you are in the mid-range of a college's published 50th percentile. Now, one of the things, again, back to Dean Gutentag, who kind of made a little light bulb go off in my mind, he said that's the general, and of course, when you're looking at Duke, their mid-range is 1520 to 1560. That's darn near perfect. And most of us would never see those scores, right? But he said, if your scores are very high for your high school, keeping in mind that the colleges get a high school profile with each application, which tells what the mid-range is for the high school. Because remember, the high schools get all the scores, the ACTs, the SATs, and they compile a mid-range of their kids. And they usually put it on the high school profile. And what he's saying is if your scores are really extraordinarily high for your high school, and even if that means that you're not in the 50th percentile, that maybe you should consider sending your scores, which is sort of a different.
And it's like another way of looking at it all.
Right. And it becomes so complicated, and it's been the worst. I mean, for my students, my families, but also when I see the message boards for all of my colleagues, it's constantly my student has this score, that score, whatever. Should they submit to this college or that college? And it's a headache.
So somebody actually shared this, and I know that this goes on, but let me just read it because so that other people recognize that this goes on. She's saying that SMU subtly suggested that her daughter apply with no test after she sent a 1350 to them. The daughter agreed and got accepted with merit. Seems like they're playing the game, they're gaming the stats too.
That's right.
And they are.
They are. And in other words, they saw that this was a wonderful applicant who had so much going for it, that showed so much character and had recommendations, whatever, that were so strong that they really wanted to admit her. But that score might lag down, drag them down a little bit, and maybe they would. That is not uncommon. I wish it were not the case, but it happens. And also I have to say that a number of colleges in their presentations to counselors and to families will say, if your score is below here, don't send it. We don't want to see it. And so they're a little bit more upfront at the beginning, but then when you get a situation where the college comes back after the information has been submitted and says, that we'd like to admit your kid, but don't send those scores. Another way around the issue is a number of these colleges that the score ranges are going kind of kafooey is that they've got some very creative admit programs where if they admit you to start in January, they don't have to put their scores in the pool. And so you're seeing a number of colleges that are having these delayed admits, which releases them from reporting scores as well. So this mid-range thing is very complex, and it's very difficult I hate to use the term, it's very difficult to game.
Yeah. So somebody asked, and I just want to make it clear, well, first of all, where the data came from, because I think there's a little bit of confusion because people keep calling the College Board. This data is not from the College Board, it is from the Common App. That's the organization that manages, the Common App, the platform, and where your students are sending the majority of their applications through. And this is public information. They have it on their website. Just a matter of whether or not you want to dig in and look at it. But so just wanted to clear that up because of that confusion between College Board and the Common App. Again, this is Common App data. It's not College Board data.
College Board just oversees tests.
Yes.
And the Common App, it oversees the largest group of applications in the country. It's not the sole application platform, but it is certainly the most powerful and has at its fingertips really good information. Which up until the last 2 years, it had never shared before. So we're kind of excited to see it. And Debbie's just done such a wonderful job of putting it into charts and making it visual for you. So that's pretty cool too.
So this information that I'm sharing now is not from just early admission. This is from a summary from last year of all of the data that came in from the Common App from the whole season, both early admission and regular admission. And what we found was although the majority of students apply to 5 or fewer colleges, again, there are these subgroups. So if you look at the numbers, 53% of students apply to 1 to 5 schools, but then it starts to jump. And 21% of students apply to 10 or more schools, which is a lot. And then even in that higher number of schools that students are applying to, 2% are applying to up to 20 schools. And there's been an increase from, when they started tracking this 2014 to today. This number of students that applied to 10 schools or more increased from 8% to 17%. So this goes along with all the numbers that we're seeing. That's why there's the number of applicants versus the number of applications has increased much higher than, even though the number of applicants are increased, number of applications is increasing higher. And again, because of this unfortunate uncertainty, and particularly as more students are applying to those selective schools, and because of test optional, that's where we're seeing students applying to more and more schools, which again actually kind of continues to feed into the uncertainty, because at the end of the process, your student can only go to one school. And so if they've applied to 10 or more schools, maybe gotten into 5 or plus schools, those schools that they've gotten into are now uncertain whether or not you're really going to come. And it's obviously makes it their yield management, which Nancy explained earlier, hard for them to control.
I got there was a note in the box. I will give Debbie the link to the Duke presentation, and she can just send it out with to everyone, rather than me trying to get it and get it to you in the chat box. Ordinarily, I'd do that, but I think we'll do it through Debbie.
Yeah, I haven't seen it either, man. Nancy told it to me before we got on, and it sounds very interesting. It sounds definitely worthwhile to watch. So somebody's asking, why are schools asking us to change? Oh, this is a good question. Why are schools asking us to change our application to ED2 from EA? Does that mean that they like our application and want us to commit, or can't read, or we can't read into what they're asking?
Well,
this is a good one.
Very good question. We don't know. Let's just start with, we don't know much about the ED2 pool. Okay. We don't know very much at all, because colleges are not required and they do not provide us information. We know generally that is a much smaller pool than ED1. We also have a very strong feeling that it gives a bit of an advantage as well, but we don't have any numbers. We can't really dig in.
So, and let me just clarify, when Nancy says we don't have any numbers, we actually get numbers about early decision, but they are lumped together. So right. It combines early decision 1 and early decision 2. So we don't really know what the breakout is.
Right. But a number of colleges have begun, and I named them, but have begun to, suggest, well, why don't you switch over to ED2? if your student really wants to go there and has that same level of personal commitment and wants to do it, then it may give them an advantage. It will give them a small advantage. Will it guarantee admission? Not necessarily. It will give them an advantage, but with any kind of an early decision, you really want to be sure. You don't want to force a kid to make that kind of commitment if they don't really feel that it's like a marriage. I mean, you don't want to go through divorce or have buyer's regret or whatever. So if the student has that strong feeling, yes, you probably would get some advantage of doing that. If they don't take the opportunity, my experience has been, and small experience, but my experience has been they won't get in.
Oh, that's very interesting, because basically the college is giving you that nudge. And if you don't kind of
and you got to remember regular decision admission rates, you're usually looking at the overall, what happens is that you look at the early decision admission rates, you look at the overall admission rates. But if you actually drill down deeper to look just at regular decision admission rates, you'll find them painfully small. Regular decision is for these very selective schools. Regular decision is very, very selective, and it's a more selective than the overall than the overall pool. So, be careful when you're going into the regular decision pool for some of these.
So there's a question here. Do you think that there's an advantage to submit early admission application like way before the deadline? Does it matter if the deadline's November 1st and your student is sending it in September or October?
Well, we like to say that it shows, one advantage. The one advantage is if you are applying to a place that offers interviews, that if you can get that application in and complete, and then they can process it and begin to schedule an interview for you, that would be, an advantage. Colleges tell us that, they do kind of read before the deadlines, and they do get started. Matter of fact, I did a survey at a major conference in Houston a couple of months ago. And they said, almost all of them said, yeah, we start reading them earlier, and maybe they're feeling a little better and warmer and more welcoming, and maybe they get nervous towards the end where the numbers are going away and the spots are going away. But generally, there shouldn't be so much of an advantage. It does show organization. It does show commitment. And maybe those are subliminal messages that are conveyed to the reader. You don't know what's going through your reader's mind. It's a difference when you're reading an application at 10 o'clock in the morning and you're bright-eyed, bushy-tailed versus midnight, when you're exhausted and you just hate everybody in New York, whatever. So it's hard to say those things. So much goes on behind the curtain that you never know about.
So there's another good question about if a student has been deferred at that point, how should they look at whether they should stick and stick with regular decision and see how that deferral goes, or should they consider maybe moving on and applying ED2 someplace?
Again, it's back to the love story. And sometimes you don't fall in love until later. I mean, it might have been that you thought that this first fiance was wonderful, but then when he broke up with you, it was like, okay, the second person is great. Maybe I like him better. If you continue to do your research, you learn more about different colleges, you might actually find that the ED2 opportunities and it's something that you really want. But again, you don't want to force a commitment when the feelings aren't there. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of reasons. Again, we don't know anything about ED2, but I've certainly seen kids denied in ED2, which ends the whole process right there. And that's a mercy too, in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But early decision is a commitment, and you don't want to enter into any kind of a commitment unless you feel strongly about it.
So there was a question earlier, but we'll try and get to it now, that asked, the example was, their student was accepted to happen to be in Fordham. So they got the acceptance, but Fordham is saying, we can't tell you until February what the merit money is going to be. Any thoughts?
That's for an early decision.
Yeah.
You sure that's not early? It's early.
Oh, yeah, I think that they
Early
are
action.
early action.
Well, early action, then they have until May to make a decision.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
it's not- but the early decision, they really have a responsibility to get you that your money sooner rather than later. But again, there's again, the Duke fellow today was pretty blunt about, please don't be applying early decision if you really feel uncomfortable and need to have the money squared away. Early decision is not necessarily for financial aid applicants.
So going back to information that the Common App has shared, and again, this was like from last year, and this is a summary of what they found as they dug into those students who were the high volume students, that 2% of students that were applying to 20 schools, or even I think it was the 20% of students that were applying to 10 plus schools, is that these students tended to come from private schools. I mean, in all honesty, they probably, are getting better or more advice, coming from a private school, and that's why they're applying to more schools. They are also 6 times more likely to have applied to an early decision plan. Actually, this is probably just an early admission plan. It could have been, early decision or early action, but the point is that they are applying on the early side. The high volume applicants also tended to be international students. And they also tended to be students who were submitting their test scores. So kind of all of these characteristics somewhat go together. They are students probably from families, and it didn't list it here, but they were probably from higher income families that are kind of learning, all the pieces of the puzzle, and knowing how to use those pieces of the puzzle. So I don't know, Nancy, if you have any other thoughts.
No, I think it speaks for itself.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought this was an interesting quote. This is from the Common App itself, saying, as the chances of admission, this is actually talks to kind of the chaos that we've seen in the whole process. But as your chances of admissions to any single institution becomes more uncertain, then the overall odds of admissions to at least one can be increased by submitting more applications. This is Common App's explanation of why there's more why students are applying, are sending in more applications. I mean, that's part of it. Test optional is part of it. I mean, it's just that there's less uncertainty, or more uncertainty, less certainty, as there are more applications in the whole system, then there's less certainty about whether or not your student's going to get in. And I'm sure if you've been reading all of the Facebook posts these days, you saw it this week. You saw that people had students that were surprised that they were, and I have some quotes I'll share, that they thought they were safety schools and their student didn't get in. So, and that's kind of Nancy's comment earlier, that any school with an admission rate of like less than 25% is kind of like a lottery ticket. There's no certainty that you can put on any of those schools when you send in those applications. So, if you're trying to have a plan, of course, it makes sense that if you have quote some lottery schools, you also have to have some schools that, you don't feel are less of a lottery. So that's going to increase the number of schools that your student tends to apply to. Okay, so let's get into, these are the numbers that I was able to get my hands on to for this year. This is, so the red bar is this class of 27, and I showed information going back for the past 2 admission seasons, early admission season. Of course, we know a lot more schools, sent out decisions in the past 2 weeks, and there's probably a few more schools that shared data. But again, this is something that Nancy and I were lamenting earlier, that last year at this time and years previous at this time, when a school would send out their decisions, they actually also kind of automatically sent out some sort of a press release or an article that detailed all the numbers. And we're finding this year, much fewer schools are sending that that breakdown of all their information. I'm going to give some of them the benefit of the doubt, saying that maybe between now and January, they will send out that information, but we're just getting, it's harder and harder, unfortunately, to get those numbers now. They will all eventually share that information because it's part of the common data set, but then it just becomes a time lag of sometimes a year when we used to get that data right now. And as, again, Nancy and I were talking, there are some schools that are actually purposely saying that they are not. They are actually purposely and publicly saying we are choosing to no longer share that information. And their reasonings for that are saying that they think it will, I don't know, maybe I'm not describing this well, but kind of calm down the feeling of selectivity, that, that there's too much focus on schools that are selective. That might be the case. There's definitely too much focus on schools that are selective, but I think on erring on not sharing your data, personally, I don't think that that's a good move. As Nancy's comment was, the more transparent schools are, the better for everybody. So that's just
it's our opinion, and we work in numbers. The various deans, they want to, their reasoning is that they want to reduce anxiety around the admissions process. But what Debbie and I have experienced and directly is that it kind of increases the anxiety.
Exactly.
It works the opposite way. That that you can. But if you're more Machiavellian, you might say that, well, if they release a lot of this information right now before January 1st, which is the regular, a lot of regular decision applications are due, it may cool the interest in the college and they might receive fewer applications. Who knows?
Who knows? Exactly. So just looking at there's these kind of graphs and numbers, and the numbers that I put in are only like the numbers for this year. So the class of 27, Amherst, and you can't, and I have a next slide. You can't always just look at the acceptance rate, because the acceptance rate obviously is a factor of how many applications they got and how many students they accepted. So, we'll look at those numbers because in some cases, applications went up. So that's what's driving down some of the admission rates. But, overall, I think some of the schools kind of held themselves the same. At Amherst, it's 25%. Boston College did big, over the past 2 years has seen a big drop in their early decision rate. And I think that's really coming from they're having an increase in their applications that are coming through. So the Dartmouth is dropping a little bit. Again, it's really more from an increase in applications. Interestingly, Emory actually increased in terms of their early admission results. And I think that was from a combination, again, of they took a few more students than they normally do early, and their application numbers dropped a little bit. So that's what, caused their increase. But, these are interesting to look at, but I wouldn't look at just these numbers, and go ahead, Nancy.
There's a question out there that I think we should answer. SCEA is single choice early action. It basically means that there are rules around what other kinds of colleges you can apply to. You cannot apply to any early decision schools, and you can't apply to any private early action. Restricted REAs, restricted early action, and that basically there are only 2 colleges in the country that use that. It's Georgetown and Notre Dame, and it's basically you can't apply anyplace else binding early decision, because they feel that removes any possibility that you could ever accept an offer from them. And they're thinking that that's not fair. So the 2 colleges, restrictive early action, single choice early action is Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Caltech now, very selective schools that use it to kind of limit your ability to maneuver and apply to a bunch of other schools. It's not exactly binding early decision. You still have until May 1st to decide, but it does restrict where you can apply. Okay, Debbie, go ahead.
No, so I don't, so Nancy, there's a question about Brown, and I actually don't really know enough about this. It said, do we know why Brown delayed their ED announcement from December 17th to December 20th?
There's
Have
a lot of
others-
complaints about it. Everybody's complaining about it. It's probably an administrative issue. I don't know whether they were overwhelmed with applications or maybe their computer crashed, who knows? But they certainly haven't, that I have seen. Now, somebody else might have seen something, but I haven't seen anything that explains it. There, as I said, a lot of complaints. People are, usually the Ivies stick together and release at the same time, but they've been growing apart a little bit lately. So Brown really is wait, and a number of other schools are waiting too.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that delay. Usually I see a school announce that when they're going to send out the decisions, and then they send it out a day or two early, like as a nice surprise. So I wouldn't read into it too much.
Yeah, I don't, yeah, you know, who knows? We'll probably find out eventually, but I don't know.
Okay, so there's a question about the graph. Does this say that 25% of Amherst admits were ED, or 25% was the admission rate for EDEA? So yeah, so this is saying this is just
25%.
for, yeah, 25% for in Amherst, their early decision. So
That's their admit rate.
yes. So if there's nothing in the parentheses, it means that the school is early decision. If they were early action, or as people picked up on, restricted early action, then that's in the parentheses. Oh, okay. Somebody sent me a message. Oh, this is very sad about Brown. Or I don't know if this is true, but they said that they had heard that an admissions officer had passed away, and that's why there was a delay.
Oh,
So that's sad
I know.
if
Yeah.
that's the case. Yeah.
Wow.
Okay.
We're getting late here.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Let's move on quick.
Sorry.
Okay.
I haven't had my dinner yet.
Oh, no, I didn't realize that, Nancy. Okay, we're going to move. Okay, we only have a few more slides. So this is going to the point about the numbers that we looked at before. You have to also look at, the actual application volume. And again, in most cases, application volume increased. I just want to highlight the three. We can give hypotheses for two of these. We don't know. But basically, MIT and Georgetown decrease in their number of applications. We think they're probably fine with that because, these admissions offices are being overwhelmed with having to deal with the volumes that they got the past 2 years. And most likely MIT and Georgetown are test required. And so I think this year, and this was a change for MIT from last year to this year, that where they, made the announcement that they were going to be test required. It definitely cut down the volume because, the students who were just throwing their hat in the ring without their test scores could no longer do that. So I think it's actually fine. To me, they kind of accomplished. MIT accomplished with, one piece of what they wanted to do in terms of making it test required. We don't know why numbers have gone down for Amherst, but again, this is just a sampling of what's happening out there. And this is just to show people, look at the admit rate, but also kind of look underneath how those numbers are really coming together. Okay. But this is an important thing to also look at. And I only gave the numbers for the red bar, which is this year's class. Well, what we have seen happening is as schools or colleges are accepting students early, they tend to in some cases, fill up the class early. So going back to all the comments about, regular decision becomes a harder application stage or phase because there's a lot more applicants and applications coming through for fewer seats. As particularly if you look at Emory, so with the number of students they took this year, Emory has filled they've already filled their seats. 63% of their seats are taken early decision. So gone. So now all of those regular decision applicants are fighting for 37% of the class. And
yeah, I'm very proud of UVA for backing down a little bit. In Virginia, we have 4 public institutions that are early decision schools. Very unusual. Public institutions generally are not early decision schools. When they first introduced it, returned to early decision, they were early decision many years ago. The first year was 19%. I mean, it went up steadily from 19% to 25%. Then last year it was filling 30% of the class, and we were getting nervous that they were going to fill, go like Emory or whatever. But they did back it down a little bit and freed up some more early action and regular decision. William and Mary fills approximately a third of the class early decision every year, and whereas Virginia Tech tries to keep it below 20% because they feel an obligation as a public institution not to fill the school, fill the class spots in the class with too many early decision, where we know that it's a problem for people who want or need financial aid. They feel very strongly about that. So anyway, Virginia did back it down, and I think was very intentional.
But these are numbers to pay attention to.
Yeah, it's important.
Okay, Nancy, I threw this in and we can just talk about it for 1 second. And it is one school. I just want to emphasize it is one school. But I saw a lot of chatter about that people felt that their students were being honestly rejected, much more in early decision as opposed to maybe the past few years where there were deferrals. And I think, again, this is just Yale. So it's one school that shared their data. But, that might be the case. It might be the case this year that colleges, that they're just trying to make the decision faster,
Well, it's a mercy.
Yes. That's the way I would look at it too. I actually think
never going to admit the student. Why?
Better to know earlier.
Right.
I think that particularly last year, they might have been hanging on a little bit more, not knowing kind of where their own numbers were coming in.
Well, that's right. Again, it's this enrollment management uncertainty. They want to fill their classes, and they want to, some of these programs, deferral and wait lists and so forth are like candy jars, and you really want to make sure that your class is well-rounded and that you have it filled. So they're kind of, sometimes it's hard to let go of a student because they maybe we can use them later. I don't know. But anyway, I think it's not, I'd rather know that I'm never going to get admitted.
So, but do you have any advice, Nancy, for the student that is deferred? What's the best way to show that they still have, interest?
You need to follow the instructions. You need to follow the instructions on the website or on whatever notification that your student received. If the school says we will consider no further information, then you're kind of in a bind there. But most schools will welcome what is called a letter of continuing interest. It's in the trade we call it a LOCI, and the letter of continuing interest can present an earlier, once you get your semester grades in. Here we have sometimes a lag on how quickly high schools get out the semester grades. So you could attach a copy of your grade report, and basically you want to cover any achievements, awards, honors, anything that you think would enhance information that you provided earlier when you submitted your application. If you have summer plans that fit your major, tell them what your summer plans are going to be. If you've done some fundraising or anyway, a letter of continuing interest where you really tell them that if you're admitted, you will definitely attend, and you bring them up to date on information that may have happened. Ordinarily, this is now uploaded through the applicant portal. But again, please, there are colleges that will give you only a form that goes into the portal, and they will not consider any additional information, and they consider it you're not following instructions if you send them something they tell you not to send. So please always check very carefully that you're not violating anything that they want. But in any event, if the information is welcome, don't inundate them with 100 more recommendations and so forth and so on. But keep it reasonable and informative. Don't just go over the old ground. It needs to be an update of new information.
So, okay, so we'll move it along, just have a few more slides, just to summarize. As you can see, and this is important for the families with juniors. More students are applying early, whether it's early decision or early action. So, what that means for you as a family is to kind of get your plan together early, because you'd hate to miss those opportunities, and they are opportunities. So, and it's all about just planning earlier so that your student can make those, early admission deadlines. And it doesn't mean it has to be early decision, but it does mean that you should take advantage if a college that your student is interested in it has an early action, absolutely take advantage of it.
If you're prepared, if everything is prepared. B, if you've ended junior year on a solid note. If your junior year was kind of wobbly, you may want to delay so that the beginning of senior year is also factored in, especially if there's a bounce back that you anticipate. There are reasons that you may not want to go early action, but mostly you should take advantage of any opportunity that you have to get a little admissions advantage, but don't. Again, there are reasons that you might delay if you're not organized, if you're not, and especially early decision, if you need financial aid and so forth.
Again, just to summarize, we're seeing an increase in international students. We're seeing an increase in, underrepresented minority students in first gen. And even though we saw a decrease in, students who were reporting test scores, if you look deeper, we saw that there were different subgroups that were, some had a decrease and others, particularly higher income families, had an increase in terms of sending in test scores. So I just also wanted to focus on and give people a sense of there are pieces of this process that you can control and pieces that you can't control. But to recognize what you can control. And the number one thing, just the fact that you're here tonight, is you can control that you can educate yourself. Right. So just understanding the process better, understanding all the puzzle pieces, and we may not have, clear-cut answers, but you have a little bit more insight into all the moving pieces that are impacting the process. So that's important, and that's something you can control. The other most important thing you can control, and Nancy has focused on this too, is having a balanced college list. That college list is, to me, it's the defining factor, right? It is what's going to either, it actually drives the amount of work that your student has to do, going back to the number of colleges that they might apply to, all the essays that might be involved with it. It's going to define ultimately what your cost is, because depending on the schools that you put on the list, that's going to define how much the tuition is going to be, and any need or merit scholarships that you might get. And of course, whether or not you have balanced a list, a combination of some of these reach and lottery schools have to be balanced with, more schools that there's, again, nobody can give a definitive answer, but where there's a higher chance that your student is going to be accepted. So defining that college list and making sure it's balanced is so important. Whether or not you apply early, that's a discussion, but start as early as you can in this process. I would recommend that even in this world of test optional, that families still learn about testing and make an informed decision. And that decision might be that your student still takes the test, and then you decide whether or not it gets applied, or you might decide it's too much for your student and they're not even going to take the test. And any of those decisions are fine, but just get information about it and think about it. It's not a quick decision. And then a lot of what we presented tonight is data, is quantitative. That's just half the research. A lot of the other research is qualitative. It's talking to people, it's reading the websites, it's going on the visits, and this process is the piecing together of both of these sides of information that's going to help your family kind of come up with the best list and find a place that your student is the happiest at. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Nancy, in terms of advice.
No, it all manages to turn out okay. I just want to reassure you that 90% of the kids are happy where they end up, and it works out, but there's stress, and you can mitigate the stress a little bit by starting early and getting organized early and getting help where you need help. And that's what's important. But be assured that it works out somehow on all this mess. It works out, and we have lots of happy kids. And the only other thing is that in terms of your balanced list, you want to have a financial safety, as well as, an academic safety, a school where you feel confident that your child will get in, but most importantly, that that your child would be happy going there. There's no point in putting a safe school on your list if your student will not attend that school, or at least claims they will not attend that school. So that's the only other thing that I would add.
And the last thing I'll add, if this type of information was helpful for you, we run what we call a College Insights Academy, which starts in January. We run it for the year, and it is 2, sometimes 3 monthly sessions, kind of along these lines. Either we dig into data, or we're talking about different pieces of the process. We're, explaining, about letters of recommendations, or summer programs, or resumes. And so it's really meant to help, educate the parents and the families throughout the year. And there's actually only a few times a year that you can join, but just you'll be getting information in your email about it. But just wanted to highlight that kind of the session that we had tonight is just an example of the types of things that we do all year long, if this is the type of approach that you want to have towards working with your student and, and understanding the admissions process. So, thank you, Nancy. I know that I had no idea you had not eaten.
It's just been a crazy day. This is a very crazy time of year, and so I've been busy all day. So now I know it's in the kitchen. So I'm.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for all your insight and all your knowledge. Thanks everybody for joining tonight. As always, feel free to send questions. You'll get a copy, a link to the presentation tomorrow. And good luck to the families with seniors that you're still, you have a few.
Be fine.
Right, you'll be fine. That you might have, I guess, 2 weeks left of if your student is still working on an essays, but hopefully they will finish them up and you can still enjoy a little bit of the holidays. And for juniors, if you're here tonight, that is a great first step, that you're just learning all this, and hopefully you'll continue and use this information to get started early.
So nice to meet all of you. You've been very kind and supportive and interesting. And
the questions, they're always interesting questions, right?
Questions, and it's always, people are starting out in this. It's hard, it's confusing. The terminology is confusing, and Debbie's a great source, and her program's a great source of information, and take information where you can get it.
Yeah, yeah.
Make it understandable for you.
So this is our last session for 2022. Thank you, everybody. Have a great holidays. Happy New Year's. And we will see everybody in 2023. Okay.